Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Google Hangout from Sigma Xi, the Scientific Research Society. My name is Heather Thorstensen, and I'm the Manager of Communications for Sigma Xi. Today, we're going to be talking about the mental health of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers. For those of you who don't know about Sigma Xi, we are an honor society for scientists and engineers, and part of our mission is to enhance the health of the research enterprise. So this entails having healthy early career researchers so that they can do the best research that they're capable of. Many Sigma Xi members are graduate students and postdocs, and other Sigma Xi members are their advisors. So we're hoping our conversation today can reach both groups. But you don't need to be a member of Sigma Xi to participate. We welcome everybody's feedback. And if you have any questions during this discussion, you can type them into the right side of your screen, and I'll read them out to our speakers to have them answer them. So specifically during this conversation, we're going to be talking about the symptoms graduate students and postdocs might have related to anxiety, depression, stress, and burnout, when to seek help, and the research that we have so far surrounding this issue. So now I'd like to ask our three speakers to introduce themselves. Let's start with Teresa.
Hello, I am Teresa Evans. I am a recent graduate of the PhD in Biomedical Sciences program at the UT Health Science Center in San Antonio. And I currently direct our Office of Career Development here at the Health Science Center, as well as am a faculty member in the Department of Pharmacology. And I'm currently working on a research project in collaboration with both Drs. Vanderford, who is on the call today, and Dr. Lindsay Bira, who could not join us, that focuses on the effects of stress, anxiety, and depression, and the prevalence of those things in graduate trainees.
Great, thank you. And then Nathan, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Nathan Vanderford. I'm an assistant professor in the College of Medicine at the University of Kentucky. I'm also an instructor in the graduate school where I work to teach and do workshops on career development topics for graduate students and postdocs. Very interested in career development issues in this population. And as Teresa said, we're working together on a study in this area right now. We've been collecting data on this for about a month and a half, almost 2 months now. So we're excited to be part of this discussion, and we're happy to talk about the study that we're doing.
Great, thank you. And finally, Bina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bina Patel. I'm a clinical assistant professor at Stanford University, and I'm a psychiatrist that has worked in university mental health for about 16 years, initially for about 11 years at MIT, and for the past 5 years now at Stanford University. So the health and well-being of graduate students is an area that's just near and dear to my heart.
Great, well thank you, and thank you all for being here. So let's start off by talking about the triggers of stress, particularly for graduate students and postdocs in the research areas, based off of your own personal experiences or your professional experiences. So anybody can just jump in.
Yeah. One of the things that's really struck me about the graduate experience is that because it can be so circumscribed, because there are many times, just a small number of key people in a graduate student's life, interactions between them can just take on an increasing impact. And so if there are any potential conflicts with advisors, that can really affect a student's well-being exponentially. Any significant academic stressors, relationship shifts, can really have just a ripple effect that magnifies itself through a graduate student's career. So those are some of the typical things that we've seen. Certainly any major losses, difficulties with defining a career path, any questions about just sort of ongoing meaning or direction of the work can be really, really devastating in the context of not often having a lot of access to supports or knowing where to go with those kinds of questions.
So I can touch on some things personally. So for me, it was everything from, your experiment that day didn't work, and it might have been several weeks worth of working up to the point of trying to get data for this experiment, and then it ended up not working. So that's a stress. I didn't particularly have what I would classify as a great graduate school experience or postdoc. I had lots of tensions with my advisors. And so just interacting with them really on a daily basis was a big stressor for me, particularly for times where, maybe we had lab meetings or, individual meetings with those people that stressed me out like, no other. When I was taking courses, it was exams. I get major exam anxiety, so that caused me stress. I could go on and on and on about, personal experiences that I had that were stressful. But, now looking at it from where I stand now, a lot of what I see and what students come to me is stresses related to, career outlook and their career path, particularly regarding, what's seen as the traditional path of going on to eventually try to become a faculty member, when the data supports that is not, statistically speaking, that is not in the cards for most graduate students. So that as graduate students and postdocs become more and more aware of that creates more and more stress and anxiety in their life, and how to best prepare for what they can and will eventually end up doing.
So I think, I second everything that my two co-presenters said, but want to add on top of that I spend a lot of time working with international students who have a whole nother level of stress and anxiety that they go through the transition from one home to another. And then second to that, so the issues associated with that transition. And then also I see so frequently the anxiety that comes around when it's time to start writing something, whether that be a manuscript, the dissertation or thesis, or a grant, for example. And often that leads to a lot of symptoms that are similar to things like burnout. We might call it writer's block, but we could describe it in many other ways. And I see that as a very common, or more common than I would like to see, issue.
Okay, great. And then besides the issues that all three of you have brought up, such as your relationship with your advisor, your academic progress, your career prospects, the specific challenges of international students, finances are often cited as a big trigger of stress as well for graduate students and postdocs. And then just social support, not just for your advisor, but your access to other people, as was mentioned as well. Teresa, I know that you had tweeted out that you wanted to talk a little bit about careers. Is that something that you'd want to bring up now, or do you think it would fit better later?
Sure. Careers in which context?
So for careers, as far as the prospects of helping people if they feel stressed out by the idea that they might not find a good career, or...
Absolutely. So this is a very hot topic right now, and as I would think many of our listeners are aware, that this is a result of many changes in academia that make gaining a job potentially more difficult. And so I was hired here at the Health Science Center because there was a need for this kind of training and this kind of support. And I guess to address that in the context of stress and anxiety and depression, the only tips that I can provide are that a way to combat that is to, one, seek support. So you've heard that now 2 or 3 times. But also in that support process to have a plan. I think often the stress and anxiety will prevent, at least in my experience, can prevent folks from having a strong career plan or to revisit that plan, and it might seem like a difficult task, but with the right support, I think having a career plan of some sort, there's no one size fits all, but a career plan for you can help to keep you on the track, even when maybe you feel like you don't know where the track is. I don't know if that answered your question, but...
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, if I can add to that, so what I frequently tell graduate students and postdocs is, for people with a PhD, the unemployment rate is well below the national average. It's like 2% or something like that. So, granted, only a small percentage these days of PhDs will go on to be faculty, But if you think about that versus the 2% that are employed, that means PhDs go on and do a vast array of really important, highly impactful jobs and pursue highly impactful career paths. Mm-hmm. So I think that's comforting for graduate students to hear. And then, as Teresa said, it's all about putting a plan in place to get where you want to go. And so the earlier you plan, you're going to be successful, but the earlier you plan, the earlier you're going to see that success bear fruit.
Okay. And so, Bina, go ahead.
I was just going to say that one other component that I hear from students a lot is if they are considering pursuing a career that's not in academia, many of them really struggle with being able to share that with their advisor. They often feel as though if they make that explicit, their advisor, the department, won't be as invested in them. And one conversation that we often have is it's really a question about being able to have their advisor feel effective in their role in terms of helping them. So the earlier they're able to clarify the plans, the better the conversation can go from both ends of, from both parties.
Great, okay. And so we all have those moments where we feel a little bit tired or we feel stressed or worn out. So Bina, I was hoping you could share with us the symptoms that we might experience when we're going through that might be a signal that it's something a little bit more serious.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to. And first of all, I just want to stress that we are happy to see anybody for any reason. In fact, no reason is too small. If you're thinking about coming in to talk to somebody, we much prefer people coming in at the early end of the spectrum. Oftentimes, if we can have a conversation or two around what the right kinds of supports might be, how they can access what they may need, we can prevent things from becoming more entrenched. So I really want to stress that people often think that there's a threshold they need to cross before they can think about accessing mental health services on campus, and I'd really like to encourage people to come in early. That being said, I think there are certainly some key areas to think about in terms of when it really is important to seek help. For a lot of students, they're really focused on functioning, so they may not be registering emotions to a high degree on a day-to-day basis, but any significant changes in functioning, especially sleep, any persistent sleep difficulties, difficulty with getting sleep that feels restorative, any changes in appetite, energy, especially focus and concentration. These are really common things that students will come in initially saying, which is a common entry is just that I'm not able to do my work, I'm not able to be effective, and so there's really a change in functioning with that. For many of our students, particularly international students or students from different cultures, a lot of the initial things that they may notice may be more in the realm of physical symptoms. So they may be experiencing headaches, stomach aches, rapid heart rate, difficulty breathing, anything that's persistent or lasts is certainly something that warrants evaluation and a conversation. And then a lot of students do come in with just a persistent sense of really not being able to focus on their work, not being motivated to go to class, patterns of really missing classes, missing research meetings, missing meetings with advisors or canceling those. I think are certainly a hallmark that a student may be falling into a pattern of avoidance that can be problematic. And again, the sooner we can intervene in that cycle, the more constructive it can be. Other things that come up, certainly around the realm of anxiety and depression, would be persistent feelings of just sadness or intense anxiety, feeling demoralized, really having difficulty being able to picture a future for themselves, both in the short term in terms of their work and research, but also in the long term, as both Teresa and Nathan were alluding to, just an ability to be able to imagine their future in a way that feels constructive to them. And then certainly, I think for most students, there's a sense that they should always be working, and so when we ask about if they're able to enjoy activities in general, we often get an answer that, well, it's hard for me to give myself the time to do anything because I always feel like I should be working. But one key hallmark that someone's mood may be shifting into a realm that feels more concerning is just a persistent lack of ability to experience pleasure in a lot of other areas. Finding themselves withdrawing from other social supports, not interacting with friends, with roommates, with partners because they're concerned about time for work or because they're feeling so badly about themselves that they can't really allow others to get close in that way. So those are some of the concerning things that we often hear graduate students coming in with. Obviously, anything that strays into the realm of feeling so hopeless that they wish they weren't alive, or any thoughts about safety or clear, clear harbingers that we would want to be able to address. But most symptoms start at a much earlier stage.
Oh, Bina, I'm not sure. Did you freeze up there? Are you back?
I'm good. Can you hear
Okay.
me?
All right. Yep. And I caught all of that. So it just was at the very end that you might have froze up a little. So could you give us a little bit of insight as far as what a student could expect if they were to walk in to your center, for example? Would they be given counseling, or like how long of a treatment would they be? I know it varies on different, it obviously depends on what they're going through, but for somebody who's just experiencing some of the symptoms that you described, what would they expect?
Yeah, and first of all, I'll just say that there are a number of ways of accessing services. Students can walk in on call, but it's usually more helpful if they are able to come in for a scheduled appointment. And so most centers often have what's called a phone screen process. So a student will call up and they will be talking often to a clinician. At Stanford, it's always a clinician that does the phone screen, and these are all staff that are also seeing students, so we all take turns doing that. And we'll basically just ask a student a few questions to establish who might be a good fit at the counseling center for them. And based on that, they'll be given a scheduled appointment. And for most centers, I think, what treatment initially can be provided as is sort of in a brief therapy model. So at Stanford, there's no specific limit to that, but for most students, that often ends up being in the realm of probably anywhere from 5 to 7 visits or so. And then if students need more ongoing care from that, we can often come up with a plan for them to access care in the community. But initially, when students come in, it will just be a conversation about what's bringing them in at that moment. We really try to get a sense of their lives in general, not just academic lives, but who in their life can be a support: friends, family, partners, advisors. For graduate students, I certainly spend a lot of time trying to understand their academic trajectory, their relationships with their advisor, with their lab mates, what they see themselves doing in the future. And so a lot of it is really kind of us being able to get a comprehensive view of what a student's life looks like, not just what their symptoms are. And based on that, we'll proceed. Oftentimes, just being able to begin the process of speaking about something that they've been sitting with in isolation can offer people an enormous sense of relief. And if there is a more concerning or persistent issue, such as an ongoing depressive process or anxiety process, we certainly can discuss the options for other modalities of treatment that may be more helpful, more specific therapies, behavioral treatments, other resources in the community. We also can provide medication consult if that is indicated.
Okay. And I've read that universities offer counseling to students at either no or low cost in many cases. Do you find that to be true?
So it varies from place to place. At MIT, I think any student can access services for any level of care, including medication treatment, without there being an associated cost by virtue of being a registered student. At Stanford, brief therapy is provided free for any student that is registered. So if a student is enrolled in classes or lab for that term, by virtue of paying their student tuition, they have access to our health center and to counseling services. There can be additional fees that apply if the student is needing medication, et cetera, or long-term treatment. In those cases, co-pays may apply for that.
Okay.
Yeah, so at the University of Kentucky, I know certainly for undergraduates, a similar situation as what's at Stanford. There's, I think there's 4 or 6 out of, I forget which, sort of free sessions that you can do where they can offer various modalities of treatment or therapy. And if there's medications, then the students may have to pay those out of pocket, or at least cover what the insurance doesn't cover. For graduate students, I'm less clear on what the rules are, but anecdotally speaking, what I get the sense of is that graduate students and certainly postdocs don't utilize these services nearly to the level that they could and probably should. So just speaking from personal experience, when I was an undergraduate, I sought out therapy and ended up getting some medication for some anxiety issues, particularly going back to this exam anxiety that I have. It was for those kinds of reasons. But then as I matriculated into graduate school, I didn't feel like I should be doing those things for similar reasons that have already been covered, in terms of just feeling like I shouldn't have time, shouldn't be taking the time to do anything else other than being in the lab working. And so those things are real. Those many graduate students feel those things. But I think that, I certainly advise students now that if they have any hint of thinking they need help, then they should go and do that. Regardless of how they think their advisor may think that they should be, working away in the lab, take the time and go seek the help. I certainly wished I had done that as a graduate student. It helped when I was an undergrad, and I think it could have helped me more as a graduate student in particular, and probably as a postdoc as well.
And so I also want to add that we've spoken a lot about graduate students, and I think the resources are more likely available to graduate students and often not as readily available to postdocs. And some of this is because of the way that postdocs are often classified at institutions, not as trainees but as employees, and there's a whole different structure there. But I encourage postdocs who are at an institution with an Office of Postdoctoral Affairs to reach out to that office. If you're at an institution that doesn't have an office like that, investigate the benefits that are available to you. I mean, often there are some, it's just might not be as clearly in front of you as it would be if you were a student. I know that this is something that Sigma Xi has done in the past in shedding a light on the needs of postdocs, and we now have the NPA, the National Postdoc Association, who's doing a fantastic job at doing that as well. But there are still a lot of hurdles to overcome in that area, and just if you are a postdoc, don't assume this isn't for me and there's no resources for me. There are things out there. They might not be at your institution, but they might, they might be at other places, like the MPA, for example. But anyway, ask questions.
That's great. Thank you, Teresa and Nathan, for sharing that. We have a question from an audience member. It says, other than campus counseling centers, is there anything faculty can do to help graduate students with anxiety in courses without compromising the academic expectations and/or demands of the graduate education experience? So anybody who wants to chime in there.
I guess I can go first. So I think I would say the first thing, the fundamental thing is, as a faculty member, and I've made this transition myself and seen it personally, but just by carrying that title of faculty member, often trainees won't feel comfortable approaching you. So I think the first step as a faculty member to be helpful is to make it clear that you are willing to help and that your door is open and that you're there to listen. And going back to what you've heard on this call or on this talk several times is, trainees don't often feel comfortable sharing these concerns with their faculty because for fear of how that might be perceived. And I think being someone who can be an advocate for a trainee would be number one. But I'll leave it to my colleagues to chime in.
Yeah, so,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Nathan.
You can go first.
I was just going to say that this is something we hear a lot from students, that they are concerned about sharing information with departments, with advisors, for fear that they'll be seen as somehow vulnerable or not able to do the work. And many times what I ask students to do is to try to sort of put themselves in an advisor's position and ask them how they feel they could be an effective advisor to a student who is struggling in a similar way. And so many times, information can be shared without divulging a lot of private detail, but just to give an advisor or faculty member a context for why a student may be struggling. And my experience is that when advisors have done just what Teresa has described, which is to leave their door open, but also to make it clear if they've noticed that a student seems to be struggling, to just say, I just checking in, I'm concerned about you, things may be difficult in any number of ways, but please know that I'm here. And you can share as much or as little as you want to. And I think that outreach is often proven so incredibly helpful and such a relief to so many students when a faculty member can make that initial overture.
Yeah, so my mentality is that teaching and advising and mentoring should be a very a very intimate and personal activity, and to do it well and to support the trainees the best, I think it has to be personal to a certain extent. And so I work with a lot of grad students and mostly undergrads. Well, I'm not mostly undergrads, but grad students and undergrads mostly, not as much postdocs. But my mentality is that, my door is open if people want to come and talk to me about whatever the issues are, whether it's school stuff, personal stuff, whatever. I'm willing to help them work through those issues. So what I would say, and what I do say to students, is if you're not comfortable doing that with your advisor or your committee members or your department chair, seek out somebody that you can have those conversations with, whether it's somebody at your academic institution or outside of that academic institution. It doesn't have to be faculty. I think it helps if it is, because a faculty member can better understand your issues in the context of the issues that you have. But the most important thing, I think, is to talk to somebody.
Yeah, and I think the one piece that we didn't address to that question was the question about without affecting academic performance. And I think that from what I've seen, and again, I want the expertise of the group to share too, but from what I'm seeing and what I have seen personally is that reaching out and having that open door and providing the guidance will only increase academic performance. You're providing the individual with the support they need to better themselves in a way that will result in better performance. I mean, we're talking about everyone saying or hearing a lot of, I need to be at work all the time. And I hear that all the time. I hear that from students who graduate in 8 years, and I hear that from students who graduate in 5. And so often being at work all the time doesn't mean being productive at work all the time, because of the struggles that potentially trainees are going through. And so helping to alleviate those struggles can increase, most often, productivity and achievement.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's going to be people in a trainee's life, at your academic institution that you feel comfortable with addressing some of these issues, and some that you don't, and I think that's totally fine. But I think it shouldn't impact academics at all, other than, as Teresa just said, in a positive way.
Okay, great. Thank you, and thank you for that question. If anybody else has a question for our speakers, go ahead and type it in on the right side of the screen, and we'll keep watching for those as we continue the conversation. So we did have a previous question, too, before we started talking about the signs and symptoms of mental health issues. And that was what can students do to prepare for different career paths, which was something that we had talked about earlier when we were talking about careers. So I think that the person who asked the question, what they meant by different career paths, I'm assuming that they meant non-academic career paths. And so that's a little bit off topic, but if there's anything that any of you would like to say to that, we can address that really quick.
Yeah, so this is a question that I get asked a lot, and it's a very, I could go on for days, but I think the first and most important thing that someone can do to start preparing is to, like a solid and good researcher, do your research. And do your research by meeting with the experts in those career fields. So there's a term in career development called informational interviews. I could tell you all about it, but you can Google it and get all the information you need. But essentially it means build a network, go out and talk to people who are doing what you want to do, or maybe are doing something that you might want to do. The more people you can talk to, the more you will have a clear understanding of where you might fit, and the bigger a network you will build. Statistically speaking, positions are gained because of networking more than any other reason. And so it's do your research and build a network, I think, are the two top things I would say right out of the gate for getting started and preparing for those kinds of careers.
Yeah, you Heather, you mentioned that this was off topic, but as we've already talked about, is this can be a major stressing point for students, trainees, and I agree. You have to develop a plan, and as part of that plan are all the things that Teresa just mentioned, and then you have to execute the plan. I mean, you've got to play a very active role in preparing yourself for whatever career path you want to pursue. You have to do so, maybe against your advisor's wishes sometimes, but ultimately you're going to be the one that's going to be pursuing in this career path and having a career in general, no matter what that is. So you're the one that has to take an active role in making it happen. So I think just exploring what you might be interested in and doing informational interviews is one of the key ways to find out things that you could be interested in, and then developing plans around how best to land in that career path is the advice I would give.
Okay, great, thank you. And we have another question. It is, do you see a difference between male and female grad students / postdocs in reporting and or addressing stressful situations? So Bina, I think that's probably...
Yeah, so it's interesting. I don't have the exact numbers to back it up right now, but I think anecdotally, my sense is that there can be some gender biases in terms of when students seek help. I do think that we often see, I think, female graduate students coming in maybe a little bit earlier in the process, reaching out and being open about talking about what may be going on in that way. But I think that at this point, I don't know the numbers in terms of the gender breakdown around that. I do think that, often more than gender, this is often based in terms of the structure of an individual's department. So some departments where students may be in, more sort of constructive and supportive labs, there's often a way that these concerns get addressed within the work setting itself. Other times, students may be in settings that are more isolated, in which case they don't have the same kind of access. So it's an interesting question. I wish I had the numbers for you in terms of our gender breakdown, but again, my sense is that there probably is a tendency for women to come in a little bit earlier in the process than men, but I don't know if Nathan, Teresa, if you have any numbers to reflect that.
So this is, to me, an extraordinarily interesting question, and so the study that Teresa and I and Lindsay, our collaborator, who wasn't able to be here today because of clinical duties, the study we're doing right now, we haven't started analyzing the data. The survey's still out there. The survey's measuring, as Teresa said, various issues related to mental health and well-being. It's somewhere around 60 to 70% so far of the respondents are female, which is mind-blowing to me. But apparently, what I was told recently, that females apparently are more apt to fill out these kinds of surveys. I don't have data for that, but I was told that. And then, it's interesting to think about it in context of this question. Could it be that, females are more apt to seek out help or be interested in this conversation more generally, particularly for improving their health? I'm not sure. I mean, we know that men are really bad about taking care of themselves in general, more so than females. So maybe it all plays in together. I don't know. It's a really interesting question.
Okay, and so since we've started talking about the survey that Nathan and Teresa are working on, would you like to go ahead and describe that survey and then talk a little bit about why you wanted to put that survey out there and what your study's about?
Sure. So the survey itself, like we've spoken about a little bit, looks specifically at the signs and symptoms associated with stress, anxiety, depression, as well as burnout, and also asks some questions about general academic sort of well-being, so mentorship, career progression, those sort of questions. It's open to anyone who is either in graduate education, so master's, PhD, postdoc, or I guess in the case of a postdoc who's already gotten their degree and moved on. And the survey asked questions regarding that. And to get to why, I have to say it was, as for each of us, we have a story of why we're passionate about this study, but I have to say that for my experience and my career path so far, it started in graduate school where I had colleagues who I watched go through these issues in different levels. And you've heard about how to recognize the signs and symptoms. So all of those levels from the very beginning to. So I watched it as a student and thought, maybe this is just coincidence. I guess my background is neuroscience, the department I'm from, although I didn't study as a graduate student depression. Many of my colleagues did. Our department has a lot of faculty in that area, so it's something that I know well. And I guess I knew the statistics, and it just seemed like the population I was a part of didn't meet the national average. If anything, it exceeded it. So I transitioned from being a graduate student into being a faculty member and advisor with an open door policy. No one told me or trained me in any way how to handle these kinds of situations. All I had was my personal experience and the limited understanding I had from my education as a neuroscientist. Again, not neuropsychologist, neuroscientist. So, over the last couple years, trainees have been coming into my office and very bravely confiding in me. And I've had to learn enough to be able to get them to where they need to be to get the support that they needed. And I then, as the researcher in me, I started looking for papers in this area, what's been published, anybody talking about this, and was kind of disheartened by the fact that there were very few papers looking at graduate students and even fewer papers looking at postdocs, but that there were stacks and stacks of papers looking at medical students. And so there was some work, there is a lot of work actually in the medical student realm looking at stress and depression. And so I met Nathan and we were collaborating on some other projects, but he had also published a paper, a commentary about this that included this topic and was clearly passionate about it. And so I reached out to him and we collectively reached out to Lindsay, and here we are. But I have to say that my goal and really kind of wanting to do this was just to get the conversation started. So thanks to my co-presenters and Sigma Xi and the people listening today, we've accomplished goal number 1, which is starting the conversation and getting people to be aware that this is an issue. And so hopefully the data will continue the conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, for me, it was anecdotally seeing some of these things in some of the trainees that I interact with. And then, as I've already spoken here today, my personal experience really speaks to these issues. And then, if you Google this topic, there's not very many studies, as Teresa said, but you can find lots of anecdotal, commentaries on this on blogs and on, other media platforms where graduate students are, recounting their particular stories about the depression or the anxiety that they went through as graduate students. So it's a hugely unmet issue and unmet need that needs to be addressed. And so as Teresa said, we hope that the study can help carry on this conversation, and then eventually the ultimate goal would be to try to identify ways that we can intervene, either locally or more globally.
Okay, great. And how long is that survey going to be open for?
Well, that's a good question. It's one that we're debating now. So we have, as of right before I jumped on this call, we have just under 2,200 respondents, and this is, as Teresa said, this is open to any trainee anywhere in the world, really. So these respondents are a mix of people from all over. It's mainly U.S. folks, but there's some international as well. So it's interesting. Our original goal was that we wanted 1,000 respondents, and so we've exceeded that, which we're elated about. What we're doing right now is that we wanted a good balance of people in the sciences as well as non-science fields. And so at the last time I looked at the data, we're mostly still in the science fields, maybe 30% non-science. So we've left the survey open longer to try to get more humanities, social science folks to take the survey. So, Teresa and I have actually just been exchanging emails this morning about maybe closing the survey soon, but I suspect we'll leave it open certainly through the end of May and potentially a little longer. We're doing very specific things right now to reach out to the non-science community. So as we continue to reach out to that community, we'll keep it open longer. But again, that's not to say that we'd still love scientists and people in the sciences to still respond as well.
Okay, and then to think about what Teresa and you were saying about how very little actual data has been collected about this topic, would you say that from what you've seen with your 2,200 responses, is that building up to one of the bigger studies about this, a bigger sample size?
So I would answer that question and say yes. I mean, there's been some large, so I guess yes and no. So there's been some large studies with large sample sizes, but those sample sizes have been within one institution, maybe 2, 3 institutions. This is the only study that I am aware of that has collected data on these specific topics in a snowball fashion, and with predominantly the use of social media. So it's a really unique sample, and that hopefully will get more diversity that way.
Okay. And so could you also talk about some of the other findings that have already been released based off of these other studies that have been done so far?
Do you want to start, Nathan, or do you want me?
You can go for it.
All right. So I actually spent some time in preparation for this yesterday. Like, oh my goodness, I got to make sure I'm ready for this particular question. So I'll do my best. So the big studies around graduate students and the most recent ones that are kind of in the news lately, is a study out of UC Berkeley. And that's I'm going to cheat and look at my notes, but the UC Berkeley study is Mental Health, Need Awareness, and Use of Counseling Services. No, just kidding, I lied. It's the Happiness and Wellbeing Report. And so the UC Berkeley Happiness and Wellbeing Report was sent out, actually is a really interesting endeavor that was led by graduate trainees at UC Berkeley. And it collected from a large sample, so talking about sample size, it was started with 2,500 students, but they had about 32% response rate, right? So of the 2,500 they sent it to, 32% responded. And this study actually supports a lot of what we're saying today, which is that those who had high levels of stress and anxiety or reported lower levels of well-being actually had concerns about their career progression, had concerns about their actual experience as a graduate trainee. And so that was one of the studies that got us started thinking about what are we going to include in our survey, and how can we sort of build on that. Other studies in graduate trainees, there's a couple that look just at international students. So I brought up the issue earlier about international trainees. There's one study that looks at actually individuals from China and shows that there's a much higher rate of anxiety and depression in individuals who are international students from China as compared to the general populace. Further, there's a report from, not here in the United States, but looking at the UK. And the UK showed that, are starting the conversation actually years ago, about 2011, started the conversation about how in the UK there needs to be more access to resources. So we were talking about how our students have access to all of these resources. Well, in the UK, they're like, well, we know there's a problem with anxiety and depression, but we also know we don't have the resources we need to meet this need. So people in general, I mean, they're talking about this, but you've heard me talk a lot about graduate students. And there are a few other studies. Of what I have found in my searching, I found 9 pretty decent studies that look at graduate students. And again, these aren't all just graduate students in the biosciences either. Some of them are more diverse than that. But when you start asking the question about postdocs, there's only been 1 study. And I was not surprised, but it was serendipitous to find that this 1 study was done actually at my sister institution at the University of Texas, San Antonio. And so this study looked at the relationship among sort of coping and resilience and mental health in postdoc trainees. And they looked at 200 postdoc fellows, and they found that, as would be expected, that they don't have the ability to cope and the resilience that you would expect that you would hope that they would. And you've also heard us say things about burnout. And the reason that we're including burnout isn't because, is because of some foundational studies that were done actually in faculty. And so there are a couple studies in biomedical faculty that show increased amounts or increased prevalence of burnout in the faculty population. And so that begs the question of, well, is that trickling down to the trainee populations or maybe trickling up or vice versa? And so you can find those studies. One was an MD Anderson kind of study, qualitative study, where they asked some questions about burnout of their faculty. And then the other is a Mayo Clinic study where they actually did a survey and got respondents that way. This is, kind of an overview in a nutshell, but there's also a really good paper that I would like you to send you all to that was actually published recently in Nature Biotech, correct, Nathan?
Yeah.
Nature Biotech that reviews many of these. And so if you're interested in the current state of the literature, I would encourage you to go there.
I'll just add that one particular study, I think it was at Emory, found so there seems to be higher rates of these issues in the trainee population versus the rest of the normal population. But perhaps more concerning is the higher rates of severe issues such as thoughts of suicide or plans for suicide. So this, I think, highlights the fact that, as we've said several times now, if you're having even minor issues, trainees or whoever's listening today, you should really go and talk to somebody. Period. I mean, schedule an appointment today or go with whoever. Just go and talk to somebody.
And I also need to correct myself because I misspoke. So the postdoc study was not the UT San Antonio study. It was actually a study done, I believe, at the University of Hawaii. I'm sorry, I made that mistake. We actually had a really great chat with the author of that study, and so I encourage you all to take a look at it as well.
Okay, thank you. And also thank you, Nathan. That was a really important thing to say. I think what we've heard a lot already is that people often don't seek help because they don't think that they have the time, they don't think that they have a level of problem that's ready to seek help, and often that's because of a stigma surrounding mental health. So I was wondering, Bina, as somebody who works a lot in this, field, what would you say about overcoming the stigma or overcoming that sense that maybe you're not really having a problem if you're having some of those symptoms that you mentioned earlier? Oh. Looks like she's having some connectivity issues. So Nathan and Teresa, I know, Nathan, you just said, you feel it's important to seek help. Is there any other closing thoughts that you guys would like to add about that? Oh, is she back?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, you're back now.
Yeah, I was just clarifying in terms of wondering if someone's problem is severe enough to be able to warrant seeking help. Was that your question, Heather?
Yep.
Okay. Again, as I said earlier, I think that if you're thinking about talking to somebody, that's usually a pretty good sign that you should go ahead and make that call or make that appointment. I think that many times there can be other sort of barriers to coming in, such as cultural considerations, concerns about confidentiality. I do want to stress one thing that I think I haven't necessarily made clear is that any university health center is going to be protected with the medical level of confidentiality, so advisors, departments won't find out that you come unless you give your explicit permission for there to be any outreach or contact with them. So that's one thing that I just wanted to put out there. In terms of wondering whether or not what you're going through is significant enough, again, I think that sitting on the other side of that chair, really over the years have been so delighted when students have come in early in the process, when they've been wondering about, this is what I've been going through recently. I'm really not sure if this is a big problem, but I just wanted to talk to somebody about it. That has been so incredibly helpful, and that often means that we can, again, think about ways to build resilience, build supports for them that can hopefully prevent things from coming more entrenched later on. There is still a stigma out there, obviously, about accessing mental health care, and this is where I do think that it's often really helpful for peers, faculty, advisors, often to share their stories, similar to what Nathan and Teresa both shared today about what they've seen. We certainly try to normalize and let students know just in a general way how many of their peers that we're seeing, but it's much more powerful coming from the community, coming from people that they directly know. So I do think that the more people feel comfortable sharing times that they've struggled, this has a really powerful effect and influence on students being able to come in and actually access supports, and either through the counseling services or through any other means available on campus. But it breaks down the barriers between realize that this is often a very normative process for people to go through these difficult years.
Okay. Thank you.
If I can, I'll just add to that. I think I totally agree. In addition to that, I think it's really important for trainees and for everybody really to give themselves permission to do things, personal things outside the lab. Whether it's hobby, running, swimming, joining a book club, whatever the case is. Give yourself permission to do other things other than just think about, your research all the time.
Great. Okay. Well, we are down to our last final minutes. Is there any final thoughts that any of our speakers wanted to share that we haven't already touched on? We have a few more minutes where we could touch on those.
I guess the one little note that I made is actually following up with something that was said earlier by Bina, is that, often you might have symptoms associated with stress, anxiety, depression that don't appear as sadness, right, or as something that you would just immediately assume, oh, this is what it is. And so for that reason, I think you should, it's okay to side on getting help or talking to someone rather than waiting, because it might not be what, the symptoms that you're showing might not be what you think they are. You might think, oh, I'm just getting sick a lot. I don't feel good. It might be the flu, or, I'm making this up kind of on the fly. But the idea is that it might not come to mind right away that it's something deeper than that. And I think that's something that happens sort of on both sides of the coin, for the person who's suffering, but then also for the colleague who might be witnessing it. You might say, colleague or mentor, you might say, my mentee, oh, they're just sick a lot. And maybe that's true, but also knowing the signs and symptoms can help you maybe pinpoint that it's not just that it's something more.
Okay. I wonder, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Teresa, I know you spoke to the importance of just the influence of peers, of colleagues, and so many students come to us because a friend encouraged them to come in, or a colleague reached out to them and said, I've been worried, you've been looking stressed. I think, that just extension of support and allowing them to have that conversation is really key to helping students feel comfortable coming in as well.
Great, Bina. That was actually exactly my question, was how exactly do you breach that topic if from a mentor to mentee relationship? Okay, well, we are all out of time. Thank you to all of our speakers today. There will be a recording of this Hangout immediately after this broadcast ends on the event page in the Google event page and also on Sigma Xi's YouTube page. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.